Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here. Could I ask us, please, just to begin with a few moments in which we just come into silence and let the Holy Spirit take over. Beloved Spirit, you have gathered us here today. Keep us safely in your love. Amen. Can I say welcome to everybody? Welcome, you've come from across the world. We're so glad to have you here. Our first session focuses today on the UK, but for the next one, we're looking across at the USA, then we'll be followed by Australia. So this is a truly international gathering. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to those for whom it's 4 o'clock in the morning. Very grateful. Thank you to Scottish Laity Network, our partners who've helped us put on this series, and to Maxas and Catholic Survivors, without whom we couldn't have done this. And indeed, most enormous thanks to our courageous survivors who are here today, and you'll be introduced to them properly in a moment with Mary Varley. I would also like to thank our donors. We in Scottish Laity Network and Root&Branch are all volunteers, and that means that all the technical side of everything that we do, this Zoom, our websites, the communications, the advertising, the keeping in touch, the management of it all has to be paid for. And you are wonderful donors. You know who you are. Thank you. We wouldn't be here without you. If you come into this as your first experience of Root&Branch or Scottish Laity Network, let me ask you please to keep in touch with us by going to the bottom of any web page on our website, rootandbranchsynod.org, and you will find both a little box for subscribing to our newsletters and information we can pass on to Scottish Laity Network, and you will also find a donate button, and the same thing can happen there if you have been intending to donate. We're not taking a mid-session break this morning. We're going on right on to finish promptly at 11:30. So time is of the essence. If you want to comment at the appropriate time or ask a question, please don't raise a hand. Use the chat function on your device. Please just address your question to everyone, unless you don't want your name to be seen. In that case, just use the little drop-down box on the chat function and look for Catherine Devaney's name and send your question directly to her. That will mean that she will get your question, but your name won't be seen. We have people here today who are not visible for various reasons, and that way you will retain your privacy. You can send it direct to Catherine. Finally, we know that you'll be very mindful about your contributions and the impact that they might have on anybody here today or anyone who views this in future. We have a lot of people who wanted to be here today and can't. So we are recording this, as your notice told you. It will be edited and put up for everyone to view. And of course, that means that then you will be able to share it with your networks and friends. We believe that what we're doing here today is very important, and we want it to be shared widely. So if you are sharing information that isn't in the public domain, please be careful not to name others. And of course, we will carry out this whole exercise with great and deep respect, as we always strive to do. I'm so grateful to welcome you here. It's wonderful to be joined. And I'm going to hand you to Mary Varley, without whom today would not be happening. Mary Varley, over to you, lovely.
This is our opening prayer. Loving God, thank you for bringing us together today and in the weeks to come as we begin our Stolen Lives series of talks we're united across your world in our commitment to create a church that is safe, just, inclusive, and loving. We know that there's far to go and much to do, and we ask your Spirit to inspire, guide, and protect us on our journey. We're deeply thankful that survivors of abuse are so generously guiding us on our journey, and we pray that we'll follow their brave, determined, and selfless example. We ask your Spirit to open our minds and hearts as we react to their experiences. Guide us in discerning how we, in solidarity with survivors, can move forward following your way of truth and justice. We'll now have a moment's silence. Let's close our moment of silence now. I'm delighted to welcome some very special people this morning. Tom Doyle, who's going to be our speaker for the next talk, he wrote, "Victims and survivors of church's sexual abuse and spiritual treachery have set in motion a process that has changed the history of Catholicism." I'm so pleased to introduce you to two people who are making history for the benefit of all of us. A711, and we're going to call A711 Anne. Anne is courageous and determined. She survived clerical sexual crimes, and she was brave enough to give evidence to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse for England and Wales. Her fight for justice, as well as the appalling treatment that she received after reporting her abuser to the church authorities, are highlighted in the inquiry's final report on the Catholic Church. Now, Brian grew up in Scotland, and he left school and joined Drygrange Seminary. And it was at seminary that his abuse took place. Brian was ordained in 1983, and he loved his work as a hospital chaplain. But a year later, he made the painful decision to leave the priesthood when his abuser was appointed as Archbishop. So fast forward to 2013. When it became clear that their abuser would join the conclave that elected Pope Francis, Brian and 3 other men decided to make public their allegations. And Brian's written about his experiences in a book he's recently published called Cardinal Sin: Challenging Power Abuse in the Catholic Church. And now on to Catherine. Catherine is a very well-respected and award-winning freelance journalist, teacher, an author of 4 novels, and she's fitted in completing a doctorate. Catherine's written extensively about clerical abuse in the Catholic Church, and really importantly, she's trusted by survivors. And Catherine was the journalist that Brian and his colleagues chose to break the story of Cardinal Keith O'Brien's abusive behaviour. And more recently, she's also written about Anne's experiences. Anne and Brian and Catherine, we're privileged to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everyone. I was really delighted to be given this invitation this morning to come and talk to Anne and Brian, both of whom have extremely powerful individual personal stories, and we will this morning explore those stories. But more than that, they have shown enormous determination and tenacity in transcending their own personal circumstances and fighting for justice in the church in a way that will also help others. And my goodness, we know that in the Catholic Church, that fight for justice really is a fight sometimes. The session this morning will be looking to talk to each person individually, and then bringing Brian and Anne together to look at the overarching themes and looking at the ways in which their stories show the work that we all have to do to change things within the church. But we do want all of you here today to feel included in this conversation. And we do welcome any questions that you would like to put into the chat line. I will try to bring some of those questions in as we go through the interviews, but there will also be some special set time at the end for any comments and questions that you want to raise. Before we come to Anne, first of all, I'd like to just reflect a little bit about the principle of anonymity. And this is something that can sometimes be a little bit misunderstood, as we'll discover when we talk to Brian. The principle of anonymity is very important for abuse survivors to be able to tell their story at a time of their choosing and in a way that is comfortable for them. And I'd like to ask Brian, first of all, about this principle, because at the time of the revelations about Cardinal Keith O'Brien, all 4 complainants in that case were anonymous. And I'd like to ask you, Brian, first of all, about why you've chosen now to waive your anonymity, to write the book, and to become public, if you like.
Hi, Catherine, thank you, and welcome to everybody. I'm speaking to you from the Black Isle, which is more or less as north of Scotland as you can get. Why I wrote my anonymity? Well, I really didn't feel that I had any get out from that, because what I saw after breaking the story of Cardinal Keith O'Brien, which at its time was a global sensation really, in 2013, I did hope that the church would learn a lesson from that. And I guess, why would I be surprised? I don't think that any lessons at all have been learned, or not many, by the hierarchical church. So it was a decision I made, that I had to write about my experience, and to do that honestly and with integrity. I felt that I had to forego my anonymity. I would much rather be an anonymous person up in the Highlands of Scotland, but I've done this for a reason.
The truth is, Brian, too, that in fact, when people thought that you were all anonymous, you weren't completely anonymous, were you? Because you had actually given sworn signed statements to the church hierarchy. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. There was a call whenever the story broke that, you know, the cardinals' accusers should be made public, and we can judge them in public. But in actual fact, we exhausted every internal process that was available to us when we were making our complaints and allegations known. So we went through the nuncio at the time. We sent all our statements in to Rome and to the Vatican. So everybody who needed to know who we were knew. The fact of the matter was, they didn't do anything about it. And as I think we'll find out as the discussion goes on today, the silence from the church is what abuse victims feel all the time. So we felt that we had to break that circle of silence and go public.
And coming to you now, you're known as A711 because that was the number you were given when giving your evidence to the abuse inquiry. Could you just tell us a little bit about the importance for you today of not appearing on camera, and why you've chosen to do that?
I think there's a variety of reasons. I think I'm still at the stage where I feel it's very important to talk about my experience, particularly about the church's reaction to my experience when I came forward to report the historic abuse. But I suppose at the same time, I do have a life that I don't necessarily want this story to be part of, and the people that I do want to know my story know it, and that's what I feel comfortable with.
I think that's absolutely a survivor's right, isn't it? That they choose who they tell their story to and when they tell it. There was a dangerous moment, I think, in the O'Brien story where it felt almost as if the people telling their stories became public property, or it was expected that they should be public property. And I think we really have to look carefully at that. So, Anne, bearing in mind that there will be parameters to what you want to tell us today about what happened to you, could we maybe just set a little bit of the context, the background of your story? Could you tell us, first of all, just about your background, about your family, and about the place that church played in your upbringing?
Yeah, so church was very important to me growing up as a child and as a teenager. And I was very involved in the local parish, in the youth group, and my friends, my social life were around the church. And I think then at the age of 15, life changed forever. A very charismatic priest who was in his late 30s began to work his way into my circle of friends, a group of teenagers meeting in our local parish. And I think it would be true to say that we were quite in awe of this man. He seemed very spiritual. The masses, he said, were wonderful. All of us were keen to spend time with him, without us realising his motivation about why he wanted to spend time with us. And I think, you know, in stories that this is very typical of, there was a whole grooming process when I look back on those years from 15 onwards. Began by going to confession to him, thinking that this was really important. He was encouraging me to go to confession face to face in the priory where he lived, not in church. And I thought, oh, gosh, this is amazing. You know, he wants to get to know me. He's interested. I could share my problems. And then it progressed to being invited to go swimming with him, and that's where the abuse began. And he progressed things in such a way that I think really he had groomed my family. My parents were very impressed with him. I think he probably groomed the community, the group of friends that I was with. And by the time I was 16, the abuse had become more serious, and this continued through to when I was 18. I went off to university, thought this was an opportunity to you know, kind of escape what was happening. But he offered lifts to my parents and offered to take me to university, bring me back home. And it seemed as though it was really difficult to assert myself by then and extricate myself from what was happening. And that abuse continued into my early 20s, and was, well, just became, I suppose, this hidden life that he controlled. So I thought Root&Branch's title, Stolen Lives, was such a good title. It really made me reflect on how from that time of 15 onwards, how my life was gradually stolen and taken and controlled.
I think we'll be looking later on in the session at that very important point, Anne, about the kind of lifelong effects of abuse. But I think you've raised such an important part of the whole abuse story, and that's this idea of grooming. And you've mentioned that your abuser was a very charismatic figure. And I think that's something that we'll also talk about in Brian's story. But the idea of grooming, and we saw this, we've seen it in lots of different abuse stories around the world, particularly in places like Boston, where groups of priests actually targeted vulnerable families, single parent families, where they offered to help with putting the children to bed and praying with them and so on, because there was no father figure. And there's a very, very dangerous manipulation that goes on there. I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about how much you think your abuser was deliberately cultivating your family, manipulating the situation. Do you, if you look back as an adult, see in the childhood and the reason why he picked you?
I don't, that's a really difficult question, isn't it? Why did he pick me? He picked me perhaps because I was available, I was responding to his attention. I had this faith that he could use as a kind of hook, if you like, at the beginning to kind of hook me in. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the manipulation was absolutely considered, and very much he knew what he was doing. And typical of the grooming process, he was prepared to bide his time. He was prepared to, incrementally kind of up his game, if you like. So yes, when I look back, I can definitely see how that progressed and how that was done very purposely by him. Yes.
As a young girl, you must have been very confused about your relationship with this man. You're a teenager, you're a 15-year-old girl. I imagine you have the same ideas of romance as, most 15-year-old girls. Did you have a sense of confusion about what this relationship was and what it represented?
I was very, very confused, and I think what made it even more confusing was that when the abuse first began, it was never spoken about by him. There was this silence, and there was also this kind of unspoken idea that I shouldn't speak about it either. So it wasn't acknowledged by him, and he didn't acknowledge what he was doing until much later down the line, by which time I was already being controlled by him.
There's a whole dynamic of silence and control that takes place in abuse. And I think there's a very important area that I'd like to ask you about. And I want to make clear before I ask the question that there is in no sense am I asking you to justify anything here, but I would like you to try and explain to people who say, well, why did you not report this? Why did you not, refuse to be in his company? Why did you not tell your parents? And that is such a difficult and complex question. But can you explain to people what goes on that makes you unable to talk about this abuse?
I think the dynamics of abuse are centered around power and control. And in this case, this was someone years older, old enough to be my father. This was someone who was not only very charismatic, but very prominent in his religious order. He had a very prominent leadership role in the order. And at 15 years old, and to find even the words to get your head around what was happening just seemed impossible. And because of that silencing and because of not speaking out, then he was able to take the control, and for me to find myself then living this other life that was hidden from my parents, that I had not been able to speak about with them. It's as though you are kind of ensnared or trapped in this mesh of dynamics that it's impossible to extricate yourself from. And I think, you know, the most perhaps powerful part of, or most awful part of this experience is that when I did eventually find the courage and the strength to say to him, I want nothing to, this was now in my early 20s, so you know, I want nothing to do with this, I want to get out of this, that his response was to turn up to my flat and to rape me. And at that point, all effort, you know, that massive effort to extricate myself from this abusive say relationship was completely destroyed.
Were you frightened of this man, Anne?
At times I was frightened. I mean, again, it's very, very complicated dynamics that are in that relationship. You know, at times what frightened me, I think, most was that I couldn't get rid of him.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know, that in a way leads on to the next part of your story, because I think if people want to understand the kind of true power dynamic of abuse, you know, they'll learn a lot from the way that you actually escaped from this man, because you entered a convent, didn't you?
I did in my early 20s. I joined a religious order, and I thought for me, I mean, there are lots of different reasons, but I think for part of it, it was kind of an escape. And it was when, you know, in that religious order, his access to me was so much more difficult, not practical. And I spent several years, 9 years in the religious order, taking that time really to work out actually that wasn't the place for me, but also during that period of time becoming quite ill, and very, very luckily being able to access psychotherapy on the NHS for 4.5 to 5 years, and that's what really saved me. And at the end of that period of time, to have discovered a sense of autonomy and a sense of personhood that enabled me to move on.
I think that's a really interesting way of describing it, you know, that you discovered a sense of personhood. I think in the past you said to me something about you discovered your adult self, and that is a really important distinction. Can you explain a little bit to people about, you know, they might think, well, you were in your 20s and 30s, of course you were an adult, but what do you mean by that? You discovered your adult self?
I think what I discovered was that I did have a part of me that was an adult and that could look after myself and could look after that child. You know, the child that hadn't been looked after, that had been abused, that through the psychotherapy I was able to realise that perhaps I did have the wherewithal and the capacity to look after that part of myself because I was an adult.
You had a period of stability after this kind of course of therapy where you felt reasonably happy in your life until I think the death of your mum in 2015, was it?
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, did you ever tell your parents about what had happened? Did you ever to?
So I did want to. I did an attempt in my 30s when I was not well and in psychotherapy. I did actually write a letter to my parents to say I wasn't well and to explain you know, why I wasn't well. And I think it was too much for them to be able to cope with that information. So my mum was very concerned that I wasn't well, but she never spoke to me about the reason why I wasn't well. You know, that's been quite a difficult thing for me, but I suppose it shows the extent to which this priest had groomed people so well, that you know, she didn't feel able to speak about the abuse with me. So you're right. When she died in 2015, you know, my grief for her, my grieving for her, within that raised also issues about what my relationship with her hadn't been able to be because of what had happened at the age of 15 onwards. And that provoked some kind of flashbacks, memories of the abuse. And I knew at that stage that I had to look for some sort of healing and closure, and that it was right for me to come forward and to report the historic abuse to the church.
Well, I think at this point, you know, this turn in your story where you go to report to the church is where it's almost like being re-abused again, and isn't it, where you go to the church with your story. And I wonder, what were you hoping for as somebody who'd given 9 years as in a convent to the church? I imagine that you must have felt something of an insider, and that they would listen to what you had to say.
Well, unfortunately, when I, you know, went to the church to report the abuse, I think I was probably in for the greatest shock then of all of my experiences in some ways, because you're right. You know, I belonged to the church. I felt I was a member of the church, and I went to the church, I think, looking for support, looking for an acknowledgement, if you like, that the church would be part of my healing. And unfortunately, that couldn't have been further from the truth. The reception, I think, of my coming forward to report the abuse, I'm not saying that the church didn't take action, because, you know, they did. The priest was removed from ministry. But the process then of sharing information with me, of meeting with me, became one enormous uphill battle. And I felt as though I was an outsider almost from day one, that I was an outsider. I was the other, and the tables just seemed to have turned on this church that I belonged to, and actually, you know, given my professional life to as well, was not the church that I knew or recognised.
I think as soon as you challenge in the Catholic Church, you become an outsider, and that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because you're also isolated. So you feel eventually, many of the abuse survivors that I've spoken to eventually feel like they're the problem. It's all about them, and they are in some way flawed, and that's why nobody's listening to them or taking them seriously. And I imagine that your self-esteem takes a real battering in that process, Anne.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt probably at my lowest because of my dealings with the Diocese of Westminster, who were overseeing my case. And I think what was particularly worrying, I mean, people might be aware from media coverage, you know, that the diocese had portrayed me in emails as some manipulative, needy woman who tried to bully safeguarding staff, and basically I wasn't someone to engage with because you wouldn't be able to get rid of me. And this awful picture that was painted of me that I didn't recognise, nobody who knew me recognised. And this picture had been put together by people in the diocese who had not even met me. Some hadn't even spoken to me. In fact, most of them hadn't even spoken to me, but had built up this picture, which is typical, I think, in the church, of this victim blaming culture. So, yes, you know, the blame is on the victim and the survivor, and we're seen at best as nuisances, at worst manipulative. And I was absolutely shaken to the core, really, to see that that's what the church thought of me.
I mean, we could actually spend a full hour talking about, you know, that whole process of going to the church. So, you know, because of the limits of time, let's kind of reduce this a little bit to the basics. You had this long battle with the church to listen to you. Eventually, they settled out of court. You then put in this request to find all the correspondence about you, and you discover all these things that have been said about you, which would really dent anybody reading that stuff about themselves, where you're told you're manipulative and needy. And I think there was one where somebody said that they would just continue to play the good practice card, a really awful phrase, which we'll come back to later in the session. Yeah. But at that point, what happens? Your lawyer said that it was a unique case, that you're taking the church back to court. You've already settled with them over the abuse itself. You go back because of the distress caused by reading this email communication. Again, they settle out of court. Do you believe that was deliberate so that they didn't set a legal precedence with this case? Are they that clever in their legal dealings?
I think they are that clever. I think you know what I think all survivors know in our experience of the church is how much lawyers and insurers are behind decisions that are made, decisions that should be made on pastoral grounds, but are made by lawyers and insurers to protect the reputation of the church and to protect their assets. Yes. And interestingly, when they did settle out of court, and this was because I had felt so, I suppose, such a need for justice when, after the public inquiry, and Cardinal Nichols, was highlighted for his lack of compassion and putting the reputation of the church before survivors, and he didn't step down. And I thought, there's got to be some accountability somewhere for how the church is treating survivors with this cruel indifference that was cited in the French report more recently. And that's why really I kind of took the case against Westminster to highlight in the public arena that there is no accountability, and the church thinks that if we don't speak up about it, it can just continue. And so I hoped that my case would highlight the way in which survivors have been re-traumatized when they come forward to the church.
One of the real difficulties, Anne, I think, is that people don't necessarily know what's going on, because at the moment the church are talking a good game. They're using that good practice card to suggest that things have transformed, that they're handling things differently, when behind the scenes they're handling them in many cases in exactly the same way as they did before. So events like this, which publicise exactly what's happening, are so important. And I want to thank you for taking us through that first part of your story. And I'm going to return to you in a little while, but I'm going to speak now to Brian Devlin about his experiences. Brian, we started off there with Anne hearing about this charismatic figure who worked their way into her life. And it strikes me that that would ring a bell with you, because in your book you talk about life at seminary, and this is where you first come across Keith O'Brien, who at the time was your spiritual director, and he too was a very charismatic figure, I think. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about your relationship with him, and how in many ways he too groomed you in the same way that Anne's abuser groomed her.
Thanks, yeah, and what a moving story, and I relate to it very much. When I went to the seminary at 18, I was a very naive young man about a whole variety of things. And the seminary culture wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be like. And I was looking for role models. I was looking for someone to tell me what to do. And luckily for me, the character, he wasn't just my spiritual director, he was actually the college spiritual director. So it was a very official post. By statute, he was a spiritual director of every first year student in Drygrange. And a spiritual director basically knows who you are and is there to hold you to account, but is also there to lead you by example and work on your prayer life and stuff like that, and to guide you. I loved Keith O'Brien at the start. I thought he was an amazing, charismatic, gentle, funny, informal priest who was able to laugh and joke and take you into his company well. And as very often happens in seminaries, priests who are, in my day, it was priests who were what we called the profs, the lecturers, the teachers. They tended to gather students around them that were their favoured group. And O'Brien did that marvellously well. And so every fortnight, you had to go to him for an official spiritual direction session. And you know, it's the small things now, and listening back there to Anne, it's the small things that come to mind. I remember Keith O'Brien, the proximity, the physical proximity to me in his room when we were having spiritual direction was quite pronounced. And then at the end, and I know this sounds like a sort of strange thing to say, but that he started to hug me, which was fine. There's no problem with that. But then as the months and months progressed, he would start to take more and more risks with me. So he would slip his hand under the back of my shirt, so he was touching my naked back with his arm. He asked me to call him, and again, reminiscences of Anne's story, to call him or to regard him as my spiritual father. So that went on. And then in the late 1970s in Scotland and throughout Europe, the charismatic renewal movement took hold. And those of you who've been involved in that know that it's a Pentecostalist type movement. And it involves a great degree of physical intimacy. And I think that this actually gave this already charismatic man, Keith O'Brien, further license to be able to make those advances on me. Then it started to progress. He would pick me up from a day off in Edinburgh late at night. My friend was always at the back of the car, and he would drive us down to the seminary in Drygrange, which is in the borders of Edinburgh and Scotland. And he, first of all, was nothing. And then a couple of weeks later, he would start to caress my arm and my leg and my thigh. And there was never anything genital or anything like that. It was just really, really strange. And I know further down the line, Catherine, you're going to ask me, why the hell didn't you tell somebody about this? But I'll come on to that. So that went on, and the intimacy became more and more frequent, and it really unsettled me until at one point it reached its sort of denouement where he started, I was definitely one of his favoured students, so he started to invite me into his room at night to say night prayer. Priests have various prayers that they have to say at different times of the day. Throughout all of this, you know, I had questions about O'Brien, but I still really I liked him. You know, I wanted to be in his company and I enjoyed him and so on. But one night he'd been down there was a heavy culture of drinking and alcohol in the seminary amongst the staff. Students generally couldn't afford it, so the staff did get frequently drunk. He came up one Friday night and I met him in the corridor, and he asked me to come into his room to say night prayer. Now, he had a bedroom and a study next to one another. Normally it would be in the study, but this time he took me into his bedroom. And we said night prayer. And I remember the nuns loved him, and they put out a vacuum flask of Ovaltine for him every night, and he poured some Ovaltine, and I didn't like Ovaltine, but I took it anyway. And as we finished night prayer, he got up and he hugged me, and then he pulled me back on top of him and he was sitting down, and I was on his knee, and he started again to caress me and to tell me that he loved me, and you know, make it very, very clear to me now that he wanted to have a sexual relationship with me. And as I say, it's difficult to express how naive I was at the time, but eventually the penny did drop that this was a threatening situation and that I had to get out of there. So I left the room. Now I'm deaf, and I still do rely on hearing aids to hear anything at all. So the next morning there was an early mass. I really struggled to sleep that night. I was really, really distressed, and started to say, how did that happen? What have I done to lead him to think that that was okay to do to me? So in the morning when I woke up and O'Brien was at the side of my bed, which in itself isn't necessarily all that bad, because I had to rely on somebody every morning to wake me up because I wouldn't hear the bell. So I scrambled around for my hearing aid, and then he leaned over, and I thought, oh, shit, he's going to start again now. And he looked really haggard. And he said, Brian, I meant every word of what I said to you last night. I really love you, but I'm sorry about what I did to you. And that was the point when the penny dropped for me, and I knew that he was a fraud. I didn't know quite how fraudulent he was. And I still remember going down to chapel that morning for the morning mass. And the seats were in Abbey-style seats, so the seats were facing one another. And I remember looking at Keith. He must have had a hangover, but he looked very, very, very gaunt, very drawn. And I remember thinking, you don't believe any of this. This is a total fabrication. You're a fraud. And that's where, I guess you would call it spiritual abuse, because Keith O'Brien never raped me, and he didn't genitally assault me, but he would have. But it was, as well as anything else, it was that sense, as Anne has said, of sheer powerlessness, that there I was wanting to be a priest like Keith O'Brien, I thought, up until that moment. And 2 years in, I realised that I'd made a colossal mistake.
You use a really important phrase there, Brian, spiritual abuse. And I want to kind of consider something of both spiritual and emotional abuse, because just replaying slightly, you said in the middle there with a laugh, I know you're going to ask me, Catherine, why I didn't say anything. And I'd like to pause on that thought for a moment, because it's a really, really important one about power and control. And actually, I wouldn't ask you that. One of the really dangerous things, I think, with for survivors is that their adult self looks back on the young person or the child with the adult understanding and says, why did I not behave like an adult when I was a child? Why did I not have my adult self? And that's why I think Anne's description of finding her adult self in therapy was so important. But so I'm not asking you to do that to justify in some way why, as a young person in all of your confusion, you didn't report this, but just give us an insight into what goes on in seminary that makes Because seminaries, in a way, are the beginning of the Catholic Church's kind of silence and control over the people who become the clergy, isn't it?
I believe that it's seminary that teaches priests how to abuse power, and it teaches eventual bishops how to abuse power. Seminary life is all about power imbalance. For example, we had twice a year a process called a scrutinium, where the staff would lock themselves away into the staff room, have no contact at all with students, and we go through the student list and we decide at the end of the term whether this student would be invited back to the seminary the next term. That happened twice a year. There was no accountability, there was no reasoning, there was no appeal, there was nothing, there was just silence. And I remember in my first term, I can't remember how many students it was, but a lot of students were culled at that first Christmas scrutinium. And they may have passed their exams, but for some reason they didn't make the grade. And we have no way of knowing whether we made the grade or not. And so one of the issues there was you had to be very careful not to offend any of the staff and the faculty, because that might be the end for you. And I know you're not going to ask the question now, but I'll tell you why I didn't report it. It's because I had no one to report it to. There was nothing. There is no one for seminarians to go to. If they want to maintain and they believe that they have a vocation to be a priest, then they have to learn to keep quiet about these things. And or they did in my day. So I think that power abuse is learned in the seminary, and I think it's the seminary that's the nursery, it's the germinating ground for those behaviours to manifest themselves into the sort of clerical power and the hierarchical power that we see within the church.
You understand the importance of silence, don't you, at that point?
Silence is all you have. I mean, you can have the odd gossip to your pal, but you daren't say anything to anyone. If I'd gone to the seminary rector, if I'd gone to the cardinal in charge and said, Keith O'Brien did this to me, it wouldn't be Keith O'Brien who'd be headed up the road on a bus, it would be me. Yeah. And I'd have to go back to my mum and explain why it was that I'd got kicked out of seminary.
It's a stranglehold, isn't it? And I think that really explains very well exactly what that's all about. I'd like to consider for a minute, Brian, that phrase spiritual abuse as well, because, for a lot of people, they think of abuse as a one-off event, or they think of it as a limited event. They think of it as something that happens physically, but actually the big repercussions are both emotional and, in your case, spiritual. What was it that experience with Keith O'Brien stole from you in terms of spiritual development?
Good word. I mean, I would say that he did steal from me. He stole two things from me. When I say I was naive, I really was very naive when I went into seminary, but I wasn't, I was probably on my time. And so if you'd asked me on year one of 7 years, why do you want to be a priest? I would have said, because I believe God's calling me to be a priest. So that's the sort of off-pat answer. So for the first 2 years when O'Brien was the spiritual director in the college, I was learning that there's more to this than just God's calling me. It's about learning about theology. It's about learning about, and I found theology hard but beautiful, strangely enough. And I really started to look at what being a priest might be, and I realized that priest might be not just someone who says mass or hears confession, but someone who's a servant leader, someone who can go to the poor, go to the needy, and bring Christ's word, and in particular the Beatitudes, to those who need to hear that story. When O'Brien did that to me, and this was my, and if, as you say, looking back as an old man now onto a child, this is my big mistake, I think, and I think it's a mistake that people make all the time, and that is I conflated my belief, my faith in God with a faith in a human being. And I conflated the two and I got mixed up. And so I've learned that lesson. But I think that more than anything else, what O'Brien stole from me, and this is very hard even for me to understand, is that he stole any notion of God or divinity for me for years. So I went back into the seminary after taking a year out, which was compulsory, having very little, if any, faith that there was a God. But I felt determined. There's something in me that drove me to first of all, not to let this horrible experience defeat me, but also to study hard and to try to be the best priest I possibly could be. And I'll be 100% honest, because I had a really strong mum and I didn't want to face that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting that both you and Anne, when talking about the effects, describe things that happen within your family as well. That abuse is not just something that happens to an individual, but it can cause complete havoc within the kind of dynamics of a family, the relationship between child and parent, and the child saying, why did you not protect me? Even subconsciously feeling that there should have been some protection there that didn't arrive for them. But if we could fast forward slightly, because you do kind of leave the seminary, you become a priest. O'Brien is appointed, you leave the priesthood, and you go in to create a life for yourself. You get married, all of those things. And it's many years later before O'Brien really reappears in a major way in your life. And I just would like to kind of highlight to people a conversation that you and I had actually a number of years before the O'Brien story hit the press. And I think this is actually very important for a number of reasons. You came to me about O'Brien and discussed what had happened to you, and kind of, I suppose, chewed the fat about whether you should actually make this public. And I think at that point, we both decided that neither you nor I wanted to out somebody in the press simply for being gay. What was it that changed? Because there was a lot of confusion about this idea of homosexuality, and that in some way there was some kind of gay plot going on. And it's important that people know that that was not why you were outing Keith O'Brien. What changed between that time where we decided, no, this isn't something that should be made public, to yes, it should? What was the difference?
Depends how you want to look at it. It was either coincidence or it was the Holy Spirit, or it was a mix of both. But I happened in social media to open a Facebook account and looked, and some former friends of mine in seminary got in touch with me, and one of them told me that in the passing that O'Brien was in trouble because he'd sexually molested a priest on the day that he was accepting his red hat in Rome to be a cardinal. And because up until then, I hadn't discussed this with hardly anyone. So I just presumed that I'd been the only one. And then, so I said to my friend, look, this is what happened to me. And then he said, look, let's come out of Facebook and I'll phone you. And then he told me what happened to him. And then he introduced me to another priest who told me what happened to him. And then a third priest who told me what happened to him. And it was quite clear that this wasn't just, a guy who was a homosexual man who was finding it difficult to fulfill his vocation. This was a guy who was a predator, and his predation was leading him to abuse priests, and in my case, seminarians, who were under his duty of care. And when you think about power abuse, and if you know anything about the church and the relationship between priests and seminarians and bishops, you'll know that there's only one way that can go. So that was the crunch point. I immediately wanted to run to you, Catherine, and say, look, here's your story. But actually what the priest did, and quite rightly, it irritated me at the time, but quite rightly they said, no, we have to investigate every internal mechanism to get an investigation into this guy. So we did that. We followed all the internal routes. And let me tell you, if ever you want to understand how deeply corrupt the hierarchical organization is, then you need to follow their internal processes, because they are devastatingly corrupt. And so we followed all those processes right through. Then it suddenly and we were getting nowhere. We'd written our statements, and writing a statement about this sort of stuff is really, really tough. I mean, it really is a hard thing to do. And we were instructed, and you have a certain form of words at the end of it. I swear by Almighty God, blah, blah, blah. And then we heard nothing. And that's what happens. That is literally what happens. You hear nothing. And I think that's a technique that the church hierarchy impose upon people who are kicking up a fuss. We heard nothing. And then, and the anxiety, the paroxysms of anxiety that caused was horrific. And then out of the blue, Pope Benedict resigned, the first Pope in however many 100 years, resigned. I was in the bath at the time. I nearly sunk under the water when I heard it on the radio. And all of a sudden, Keith O'Brien, who had now a record, a litany of allegations against him, was a cardinal, and he was potentially going to Rome to help elect the next pope. And we absolutely raised our voices in horror. We went through our go-between with the nuncio, and we said, this cannot happen. The nuncio said, I am of the view that we should let Cardinal O'Brien go to Rome, and then he will retire, and he'll retire like Pope Benedict, in humility and in prayerfulness. And we said, no, he won't, because we know that the church has got form in this regard in at least one situation where a cardinal left his diocese and went and got a really cushy job in Rome. And we felt that there was a risk of this. The risk was too high. So that's when I called you.
Well, I know, Brian, that there's a very strong element of whistleblowing here. That's how you saw this, as a kind of duty and a responsibility to actually make public what was going on. But obviously we've discussed the currency of the church's silence, and there are a number of interesting comments that are coming in on chat, where people are saying things like Anne is saying they don't want to change anything, they just want plausibility, deniability. We've got somebody saying the ultimate concern of the church authorities is to protect the church and keep it safe. That is what safeguarding is in practice. So we've got safeguarding being guarding the church, not guarding the survivors, the victims of abuse. We've got somebody saying, where and how does the faith of the abuser come into all of this? Do they not actually believe in Christianity at all? Or are they somehow able to convince themselves that what they're doing is okay? And actually, I think a lot of these comments that are coming in about questioning this, perhaps part of the answer is in that old idea of the church that the cardinal sin is to scandalize the faithful. So in moral terms, that actually allows you to do anything, because your kind of moral imperative is to defend the church and to protect the faith of the faithful. When you did bring this all out into the open, did you have any sense that there was anybody in the church who wanted genuinely to hear your story and do something about it?
No, not at all. Eventually I did. Whenever we got an investigation, I genuinely felt that there was somebody there who wanted to listen to us. But I the silence, the casualness, the dismissiveness of priests who had been abused. No, there was nobody there who was at all concerned, apart from the fact, as you say, that we were scandalising the church. That's what made the difference, was this. And then it became us who was the problem. It became us who were scandalising the church. It wasn't O'Brien or the abuser's behaviour that was the problem. It was the person who was raising the concerns who was problematic. And that, I think, is a constant thing for abuse survivors.
Yeah. Just before I bring Anne back in to discuss this with the two of you, Brian, I just wondered if you could give us an idea. I mean, I was around at that time in 2013 when this was all happening. I know what a very peculiar time that was, the way the story developed, the scrutiny that came upon all of you who were talking about Keith O'Brien publicly. Just give us a quick insight into what that felt like personally for you. What were the emotional effects of being in that storm?
It was very frightening. There was a sense of, I remember using the phrase, the kind of cold breath of the church in the back of my neck, and wanting, if they could at all in any way, to silence me, then they would silence me. It was isolating. The only way to escape that was to become almost entirely reclusive. And I'm sure part of that was my over-anxiety, but a lot of it was actually based on fear. And I'll tell you one story. When I wrote the book, I didn't tell my mum, who's 91, that I was writing the book until 2 days before it came out. And I said, Mum, I'm writing this book about what went on with Cardinal O'Brien. And she said, make sure you check the brakes of your car every morning. 91-year-old Irish Catholic mother who saw her son go through something like that. And she and I would say that they behave like a criminal organisation. They behave like a criminal family. And there is a very strong sense of omerta, of organised silence that goes on, when people shake the tree. Absolutely.
I'm going to bring Anne back in here just so that we can look at some of the common areas in these stories. And one of the things I'd like to kind of look at is, we will come to the kind of long-term effects of abuse, but I'd like to look at this idea of autonomous orders. And I know this is maybe not quite so relevant in your case, Brian, but it does relate to Anne's case, because she was abused by somebody who was part of an order within the church. And one of the ways in which the church tends to wash its hands is to claim that these orders are autonomous and they can't do anything about a particular situation. I know we've got some people here from the Comboni, from the Murfield seminarians who were abused by people in the Comboni order. And I received an update this week from someone who unfortunately can't be here today, but I think some of the rest of the group are here, who kind of updated the fact that they had gone to Bishop Marcus Stock. And I think we can say that Bishop Marcus has supported this group. He's one of the few kind of people in the hierarchy who's taken a public stance and actually issued a public apology, because the Comboni order will not issue that apology. And many of the Murfield group are now in their 60s and 70s. Some of them have very sadly passed away, and they still have not received an apology for what happened to them. The update this week is that despite this public apology from Bishop Marcus and a letter being signed even by Archbishop Scicluna, there has still been no apology from the order. There has been silence still. There's been no reply. Sometimes we get the impression that things have moved on and the church is telling us that they're changing their procedures. And could I come to you and just ask you, do you get any impression that these autonomous orders are going to be called to heel by the church authorities, or are they continuing to hide behind this idea of we can't do anything?
I think that's a really important question. I think it applies also to the autonomy of individual bishops and their dioceses as well, because you know, a lot has been said about new structures in the church in England and Wales, of Catholic safeguarding, the Standards Agency, but actually, when decisions still have to be made, it's the religious leader or the bishop. Now, in my case, the priest who abused me is still alive, an elderly man now. My case should have gone to Rome to look at canonical penalties. The priest himself, the abuser, volunteered for laicization about 2 years ago. So everybody sat back and thought, right, he's doing that. Then 18 months on, he changes his mind. So he's playing games, changes his mind, he's not going to cooperate. So it falls to his provincial to send the case to Rome, and the provincial refuses to. So, you know, there might be new structures, Catholic safeguarding, but actually those key decisions about what happens are in the hands of religious leaders. And because the provincial is saying no, he's basically saying that's what the church standards might be, but actually we're autonomous and we're going to make our own decisions. Now that's still in process, and there may be other ways that the case can get to Rome, but it is a real worry and concern that there isn't a one church approach. There isn't a set of standards which they are obliged to follow, and it's a real concern, and it's something we need to watch, because in England and Wales we've got Nazir Afzal and the new board, and we just need to look very carefully to see, in fact, are they going to have powers that are going to make a difference? And at the moment, the jury is still out on that, I would say, from the point of view of survivors.
Well, Nazir Afzal has also been involved in the Murfield case, actually, and it's interesting that you bring that up. But he too has been met with silence in terms of the Comboni order. So, Brian, what are your thoughts here? Is this all out of control? Is there a kind of central safeguarding imperative within the Catholic Church, and can there possibly be true safeguarding if there isn't that central control?
I think there needs to be central control. I think there needs to be a culture change within the church. I in my own situation, I naively thought that one of the priests described that what we did when we went public was pressing a nuclear option. And I presumed that the church would learn from that. And, what I hoped for was a beatitudinal church, something which grasped Jesus's core message of meekness and humility. And what we have is a church that is corrupted. The well that Catholics drink from has been poisoned by the hierarchy in all their manifestations, in the orders and in the secular priesthood. And I think that we need a reformation. We need true root and branch reform of the Catholic Church. And I think that hopefully this series of talks and whatever else follows on will be part of that process.
What's been the reaction from insiders, Brian, to your book? Do you sense any kind of, opposition from within the church, or is it still the case that anybody who opposes is ejected?
The reaction to the book from the Archdiocese of Edinburgh in particular, but wherever, has been very, very positive. To those people who would speak to me about it, has been very positive. But, when we talk about power abuse, I look back at St Andrews in Edinburgh now and I think, well, it couldn't really have got much worse than it was with Keith O'Brien. And now what I'm being told is the culture in St Andrews in Edinburgh is a lot worse than ever it was under Keith O'Brien, because there is a culture of bullying and intimidation of good priests and good lay people throughout the church. So one form of power abuse, which is based on sexual predation, has definitely been replaced, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people who talk to me, with another form of power abuse, which is, I am your superior, you will obey me.
Yeah. I think this whole idea of hierarchy is one that, you know, with your book makes clear that unless we actually challenge this hierarchical structure of church, nothing will change. There is that kind of stranglehold over things for as long as we see everything in terms of that hierarchy. But just to bring, we've only got a few minutes left, and I do want, before we finish, just to come back to ask each of you about the kind of personal effects of abuse. I wonder, Anne, are you a different person because of what happened to you? Did it in some way drive your life rather than being something that was limited to your teenage years and early 20s?
I think sadly so is the answer, in the sense of, here I am now in my late 50s, I'm still very much preoccupied with what happened to me from the age of 15 onwards. And I come back again to, I don't know whether it was Mary Varley and Root&Branch, but who came up with that Stolen Lives title. Because sometimes, you know, I do sit back and think, yes, there've been lots of good things, thank goodness, in my life. But from the age of 15, my life changed and its direction changed, and that can never be undone. And you live with the consequences of that. And it's sometimes, you know, sometimes it's something that's easier, it's a load that's kind of easier to bear than others. But it certainly shaped my life. It shaped kind of decisions that I made earlier in my life. And it's had an impact also on my faith. And if I think back to that 15-year-old who was, Brian's word, you know, I was naive. I was, you know, so kind of involved with church and this personal relationship with God, which got confused in this abusive relationship with this powerful priest. So yes, it definitely, the impact of it is far-reaching, and the impact that on, you know, on other relationships and who I am in relationships with others as well, is something that you carry with you. And I kind of, you know, I am an optimist, I think, rather than a pessimist, and I do, you know, I do try and look for the things that I can take out of my experience of life that helps me try to, you know, to live a life that is positive. And I think part of what we're doing this morning, you know, is one of those positives. If we can speak out and if we can change things, I've always said this, I said this when I gave evidence at the inquiry, if by speaking out my story, which has so many common threads and themes with other survivors, can make a difference, and we can challenge the church and fight for change, then that's a positive.
Thank you very much. And Brian, what about you? Has it changed you and your life? Are you a different person from the one you would have been as a result of what you
Well, it's I've thought of reflecting on this a lot, Catherine, and you know, I left the priesthood, and sometimes I wonder whether the priesthood left me, and I think that you know, I've had an interesting career, but being a whistleblower is a hard job, and if anyone who takes this route has to think very carefully about themselves and about the support that they've got. And I've chosen to take this route because I believe I'm called to. I believe this is part of my journey, and part of the reason for being here today and writing the book and all the other stuff is because I believe that we have a church that's worth saving. I believe that there is good in the Catholic Church, but I do believe that it has been corrupted by the hierarchy. And clericalism. There's a priest that I would, if people haven't heard his film, it's on YouTube, Professor James Keenan, and he talks about a concept called hierarchicalism, and that is the father of clericalism. That is the deep-rooted corruption within the hierarchy that says we can do what we want.
Yeah.
Dare you stand up against us? How dare you question our authority? You will obey us. And I think that if you've got personality like mine, and I think like Anne's and yours and the countless people behind us who are saying, no, we're not putting up with that anymore. That it is not your church. It does not belong to the bishops or the cardinals or the Pope. It is our church, and we want it back.
That's a very, very powerful way to kind of bring our discussion about to a close, Brian. Most people have been putting comments rather than questions, but just to bring in a few comments here, there's somebody saying the central issue is protecting money, and they're commenting on the fact that the Camponi order in court stated its global wealth is around $600 million. So we've got the issue of money on one hand, and on the other, somebody's saying we need a positive evaluation of human sexuality. The priestly culture is on vows of celibacy, which portrays human sexuality as a degraded, fallen state of being. So we've got attitudes to sex, attitudes to money, and as you've pointed out there, attitudes to power and the sense of hierarchy. Just to conclude here with Anne and Brian, and I want to thank you very much for telling such powerful stories this morning and really putting yourself out there. So thank you very much for that. And I'd just like to conclude with Mary's question, which has come in asking, are there any reasons to take heart from what we're seeing in terms of the hierarchy's attitudes and behaviour? Is there any indication that it's changing for the better? And if I could ask you just to very quickly give me a quick response to that before I hand back over to Mary. I'll come to you first, Anne. Do you see any signs of optimism?
I think the signs of optimism come from meetings like this. I think the signs of optimism have to be with the laity, because I think that's the only way that there's going to be change. And I notice some people saying, what can we do? Well, what can we do? And I think the laity being informed, the laity being open to listening to victims and survivors, and then the laity en masse challenging the hierarchy about the state of the church.
Thank you very much, Anne. Brian, your own thoughts?
My own thoughts is that we need to have in process a more transparent way in order to select bishops. We have a problem with narcissistic leadership within the Catholic Church. And if you have a narcissist in charge, then the church won't get very far. So we need to reform that process. And that's only one part of the reform. But I would go back to what Anne said there. I think that, in Scotland, we are Celtic countries. We use the term minding a lot. Who's minding the kid? Who's going to mind the farm after I'm dead? I think the laity have a role to mind the church. It's their role to be able to stand up and not take the rubbish and the sheer arrogance that we hear from the bishops and say, no, it's our church. We want it.
Thank you both very much indeed. And thank you to everyone who's contributed to the discussion there. There's a lot of people here this morning. And if I've missed any comments, I do apologise, but I'll hand back now to Mary.
Can I just say thank you to you, Catherine? You've been outstanding.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. Thanks so much, Catherine.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Brian.
Before we close, many of you have been asking for information, and we're pleased to have Paul Campbell from Maxas here today. So, Paul, if you would like to just give us some details on support and resources that are available, and also to say to everybody you can link through to all these support and resources on the Root&Branch website homepage as well. So thank you, Paul. Over to you, Paul Campbell.
I wish I could say there were lots and lots of resources out there to support everybody. Very limited and very difficult to come by the right sort of resource. And that's been my experience. I myself am a survivor of abuse by a parish curate who came from the seminary into the parish I was as a deacon and then ordained, and I was an altar boy at the age of 10. Now, I've been involved with Maxess for many, many years, and I gained an awful lot of support from peer relationships that I had gained through that. And I have had a sort of career almost in working with social work with abused children. So I've had to pull myself up by my own bootstraps, really. Now, there are moves afoot by the Catholic Church following the Ixford inquiry to look at support, and at present the Catholic Church, if you approach any of these safeguarding advisors, they will say, well, there's this wonderful organization called Safe Spaces, and they'll sort it all out for you. That is one supervisor and 3 sexual abuse advisors. They're not therapists. So yes, it's there, and yes, there are all sorts of things, but I think that finding the right therapist is quite hard. Undoubtedly, the church, if you approach them, some dioceses are being supportive with their appointment of safeguarding advisors, but they're a very mixed bunch, and the amount of resource and finances that are available for funding is very different across different dioceses. So not an easy one to answer. It is always a strive. Maxess operates a helpline. All the people in Maxess are survivors of sexual abuse themselves, and we would try and do what we can, and there are but we're not therapists ourselves, and we cannot provide the level of therapy that lots of people need. It is a life-changing event, being abused.
Paul, thank you so much. That's a testimony in itself. We've run very close to our time. I think there are no words, I can find words to thank Catherine, Brian and Anne. I'm just speechless. I think the comments in the chat have been saying most of it for us. One swift thing I would do, please, before I hand over to Mary Varley, is to say I would urge everybody to come to our next 3 sessions, which are looking at the question of what can we do about this. It's been specifically designed for that, especially the plenary session on 24th of February. But right now, time is pressing, and I must just hand us back to Mary Varley to ask us to close with prayer and with the deepest, deepest of thanks to Brian and Anne and Catherine.
We've written the prayers for this session specially, and we're going to close with a litany. We give prayerful thanks for the courage and generosity shown by Brian and Catherine in being with us today, and Anne, to help us on our journey towards a safe, just and inclusive church. We, the people of God, recognise that the abuse of children, young people and adults is a crime. The structures of the church have greatly contributed to the damage caused. We bring to mind all those people who've been grievously hurt and harmed by priests and religious. We're truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on them, and in solidarity we remember
others compelled to work without pay and who were forcibly separated from their babies. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
children physically, emotionally, and sexually abused in children's homes and residential settings. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
Child victims of crimes of sexual violence by cardinals, bishops, priests, and religious. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
Children groomed and abused in the production of abusive online images. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
Birth children of priests, bishops, or cardinals denied their right to family life and compelled to live as guilty secrets. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
Lay and religious women subjected to sexual violence, sexually assaulted and raped, emotional and spiritual abuse by male priests and religious. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
Seminarians, priests and religious who suffered spiritual, physical, emotional or sexual abuse from those in positions of trust, power and authority. We are truly sorry for the hurt inflicted on you.
We acknowledge the harm experienced by God's people, the clergy and religious who are just and compassionate, and everyone whose faith and ability to trust is shattered by the realization of the extent of abuse within the kingdom of God. Holy Spirit, who lives within each one of us,
help
Help
us
us to move forward,
empowered
by compassion,
determination, and knowledge, in solidarity, to bring about truth, justice,
and
and reconciliation.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.